Copy, original title: The Tyrant's Northeast Favorite Concubine. Ye Yang, a straight man from the Northeast, became a concubine in Gongdu novels, and was bound with a system that could see the favorability of the main characters. The emperor will fall in love with him if his favor is too high. If his favor is too low, the emperor will kill him. In order to save his life and innocence, Ye Yang bites the bullet and creates a character design, repeatedly jumping among the beauties. But things were developing more and more wrong. At first, the move that made Emperor Go lose his favor, but later made his favor grow rapidly. Seeing that his favor was about to fill up, Ye Yang panicked. He played a snowball fight and pushed the emperor dog into the snowdrift. The ferret he raised found a decoration plan for Fengluan's imperial study with tens of thousands of taels of silver. Fengluan favorability plus 100. What's going on? And let people not be straight men. The longer Ye Yang lived, the more he felt that the emperor dog was different from what he thought. The corpses under his feet are paved with blood and bones, but behind him is the splendid scenery of the splendid rivers and mountains, and all countries come to court. A few years later, he helped Ye Yang to climb the building and look into the distance. Fengluan whispered in his ear. "I Fei, look! This is our country. Guide to Proper Consumption Ding. Imperial Express." This article will enter V on August 21, Friday. It is not easy to think about sand sculptures. I hope the little angels will support the genuine version. I love you all. 1. Mine clearance warning, male and male marriageable background, cold and calm to the outside world. Anyone 2. Look at the title to know the sand sculpture, the pure sand sculpture text. Sand sculpture is important, ha is enough, the plot is supplemented, it is overhead and overhead. Don't go deep into the text, don't look for IQ logic in the sand sculpture text, abandoning the article is not withdrawing shares, you don't have to tell me everything. Content tags, court marquee system suite text search keywords, protagonist, Ye Yang, Fengluan supporting role, receive the document swordsman heart, no love for advance receipt others, 1 sentence introduction, what are you looking at intention, to show the sincere feelings of the two of them supporting each other to grow together, and to promote the positive energy spirit of love and peace. Ye Yang entered a novel of Gongdu. He was seriously ill and opened his eyes, and he became the servant Yunyang who was pushed into the lake to drown by the original book's heroine. When his opinion changed, he could see the numbers jumping up and down from them. Such as this moment. Ye Yang, who was just picked up from the Imperial Garden Lake, lay on the bed, smelling a very faint scent of incense, turned his head to look at the belated tyrant Fengluan, and Fengluan fell into contemplation with a favorable impression of him as high as 71. He remembered the instructions that first appeared on the system. If the tyrant's opinion is higher than 100, the tyrant will definitely fall in love with him. If the tyrant's opinion is below 0, the tyrant will most likely kill him. No matter which one, it is the future that Ye Yang does not want to see. 71 is too high and must be lowered. Ye Yang decided to pretend to have amnesia. The book says that Fengluan is ruthless, and specializes in the delicate and beautiful women who are weak and willow Fu Feng, while Yunyang, the young son of Prime Minister Yun's family, is elegant and quiet, as serene as a fairy, and is just right for Fengluan's appetite. Ye Yang is different. He is a pure Northeast man. Since elementary school, he has been a resident player in the sports meeting and a champion in snowball fights. Yunyang's weak willows help the wind. His mother is an outsider, so he can take advantage of this. Fengluan had a cold expression in front of him, and his demeanor was solemn, as if even if Yunyang drowned in the palace today, it would be nothing more than an irrelevant matter to him. His tone was cold, and he spoke condescendingly, asked, "Master Yun, what's going on?" Ye Yang winked at him. Fengluan didn't understand what he meant, and frowned, as if he also blinked subconsciously. His face was gloomy and solemn, and it seemed strange that such an expression appeared on his face. Ye Yang couldn't help bending the corners of his lips, and before he could speak, he saw Feng Luan's body tingling jump out a few numbers. Feng Luan favorability +1, current favorability 72 Yang. What? What's going on? How do you feel good when you smile? Yang panicked for a while, and blurted out. RUSEI. Yun Yang, the first beauty in the harem, said gruffly, what are you looking at, looking for a cut? Feng Luan. Feng Luan asked her to teach her mother, and decided to let Yang learn court etiquette again. The previous dynasty was busy with government affairs, and Feng Luan did not want to stay here any longer. Luan's assigned tutor, Li Ma, has arrived. Mother Li looked like she was only in her 40s, and she was carrying a bulging bag. When she saw Yang, she spoke first and said, Master Yun, there are a lot of people here, I'm afraid it's not very convenient to practice the etiquette in the palace. Yang. He thought that Mammy Li might want to talk to him privately, so he ordered the rest of the palace staff to retreat, and when everyone left, Mama Li took a deep breath, tears in her eyes, looking at Yang. And well. Yang, hey! Wait, what's going on? Is Li Ma and the Yun family still related? Mother Li had heard about Yunyang's sudden amnesia when she fell into the water before she came, but she was not in a hurry. It will take a long time to think of such a thing as amnesia. The most important thing at the moment should still maintain Yunyang's holy favor. She believed that she was familiar with Yunyang, so she switched to the class mode and said, Little son, you should not remember what the slaves taught you in the past. Yang was sluggish in his heart, not knowing what the current situation was, but he could only nod his head. It's not in the way. Li Ma said, Yun Xiang is in the front, the slave will definitely help the young master to win the favor. Hearing the word Shangchong, Yang couldn't help but froze all over, very embarrassed, but Mammy Li smiled at him, took off the satchel from her waist and held it high, raising her voice in a majestic manner. There is please boudoir treasure. Yang. Yang froze. Isn't this an etiquette class? Let me go. This is not a car for etiquette class. Mother Li lowered her voice and said, the emperor is diligent in political affairs and lacks skills, so he is indifferent. According to the slaves, this matter needs some careful planning. Yang hurriedly refused and said, you don't need to say any more. Mother Li, you don't have to be shy, young master, this kind of thing also requires exercise. Mama Li turned her head and picked up the secret treasure of the boudoir on the table, opened the cloth bag, took out something from it, and said, Little master, look. Yang didn't see it. He covered his face with one hand, blushing slightly, and was about to open his mouth to refuse, but suddenly heard a loud announcement from the outside palace. The servants meet the emperor and the concubine Chu. Yang trembled in fright. Why is he back again? He came with Chu Lian. I want to give Yunyang a big hat for causing chaos in the harem. He stretched out his hand to grab the gadgets in Mammy Li's hand, but Mama Li was taken aback by his actions, slipped his hands for a moment, and the gadgets in his hands slipped out, dripping on the ground. He turned around and was rolling to Yang's feet. The door has been pushed open. Yang hurriedly said, Mommy, you are also true, what are you doing with the whole rolling pin for me, don't we have a royal kitchen? He rolled over and got out of the bed, with agile skills, he did not hesitate to kick the jade on the ground to the bed, but he did not expect that Li Ma and him had no tacit understanding, and happened to be stretching out his feet. He kicked the jade one by one. The jade is made of high-quality jade, warm and smooth. Yang used a lot of strength, kicked the jade far away with one foot, and happened to roll into the seal that stepped into the house Luan's feet. Yang stood where she was, and reluctantly finished the second half of her sentence, if Mama really wants to craft, we can't roll noodles in the bedroom. Yang. Mama Li. Feng Luan. Chu Lian was extremely dignified, stepped into the house, and asked, what rolling pin? She fell a few steps from Feng Luan, and naturally she never saw the intense scene in Kaike's house, and Yang had already crashed and went offline on the spot, lowered her eyes, turned her head, and decided to admit her death. Feng Luan stepped on the jade stance. He was dressed in a lot of clothes, and the hem of his clothes was almost dragging to the ground. But Yang could see clearly. He was stunned for a while, not understanding why Feng Luan did this. He could only see the numbers beating wildly beside Feng Luan. Feng Luan favorability 1111. Feng Luan's current favorability, 50 Yang. Yang's heart is ashes. What is this ultimate social death scene? How does he get it back? Chu Lian never looked at Feng Luan's feet, she just smiled charmingly and said, "So Yun Shijun knows cooking." Yang was embarrassed. "You're welcome, I understand a little." He was still at a loss, and Mammy Li was already frightened, so he could only bite the bullet and raise his head, looking at Feng Luan at a loss. He didn't know why Feng Luan helped him cover up this matter, but since Feng Luan had already helped him cover it up, he couldn't just watch him die here, and Feng Luan really raised his eyes slightly, but his expression remained unchanged, and he said lightly, "Concubine Chu, aren't you going to play chess with Concubine Shen?" Chu Lian was startled. She obviously didn't know why Feng Luan brought this up suddenly, but she still responded respectfully and said, "Yes." "Feng Luan, then what are you doing here?" Chu Lian, "I." Feng Luan, "Kong Ning, send Concubine Chu back." Chu Lian. Internal servant Kong Ning took Chu Lian and the sluggish Mama Li away together. As soon as the door was closed, only Feng Luan and Yang were left in the room. No, Yang thinks this scene is very bad. He couldn't tell the tension in his heart, but he didn't know what he should do for a while. He could only smile at Feng Luan, and before he could speak, he heard Feng Luan say slowly, "The Yun family scholar Mendi, did Yun Xiang teach you these things?" Yang bit the bullet and said, "This has nothing to do with my father." Feng Luan just pretended not to have heard of it. He looked cold, his eyes were dark, and he was as deep as a cold pool. He didn't see any pity and admiration for the rumored cherished servant. Seeing Yang staring at him nervously, he only raised his eyebrows. "Raise the jaw, and keep away from the cold as much as possible. Kneel down," he said coldly, "pick it up yourself." When Yang was nervous, his mouth was always quicker than his head. He looked at Feng Luan Binghan's alienated eyes, his heart was half cold, and he subconsciously had to justify his behavior just now, and said with a shy smile, "Isn't it just a rolling pin inside?" Feng Luan also looked at him, "If you say a little more, you will go home tomorrow with your rolling pin." He imitated Yang's wording, and he always followed his words, so Yang resolutely shut his mouth and dared not speak more with Feng Luan. Yang was somewhat resistant to kneeling in his heart. He squatted down cautiously, trying to pick up the jade on the ground, but seeing Feng Luan's favor rapidly dropping to 40, he trembled in his heart and hurried. He reached out to reach the jade potential under Feng Luan's feet, but the thing was being stepped on by Feng Luan, and Feng Luan obviously didn't have any intention of raising his foot to move away. Yang hesitated again and again, but he could only raise his head to show his flattery to Feng Luan. With a smile, he said, "Brother, lift your inner foot and block it here." Feng Luan favor 5, current favor 35 Yang. He wanted to lower Feng Luan's favor, that's right, but it's gone too fast. Feng Luan asked him, "What do you call me for?" Yang obediently admits, "Your Majesty." After he finished saying these words, he waited for a while before he saw Feng Luan lift his foot slightly to move away, while Yang squatted on the ground and hurriedly reached out to Feng Luan's feet, just as he wanted the jade gesture. When he dragged it out, he couldn't reach Feng Luan and stepped on the thing again. He looked up in confusion, only to see Feng Luan extending his hand to him. It's just that he lowered his brows and his eyes were full of emotion. If he was doing something he was reluctant to do, he still forced Yang to raise his head and use his fingers slightly. With some strength, a faint red mark was printed on the beauty's white and smooth skin, and he opened his lips, seemingly hesitating to speak, but unable to say the next word. Ye Yang froze his back. The cold incense smell on Feng Luan's body was vague, and it lingered on the tip of his nose, and he was half bent, with one hand still pressing the jade at Feng Luan's feet on. This scene was so ambiguous that he could guess what was going to happen next with his eyes closed, so he was nervous and had no idea what to do in his heart. After a moment of stalemate, he reluctantly smiled at Feng Luan and said, "Your Majesty, leg numb." Feng Luan. Feng Luan favorability 5, current favorability 30 Ye Yang. Half an hour ago, there was still 71 favorability, but after an hour, there is only 30 left? No. He has to figure something out. He lowered his eyelashes and said softly, "Tomorrow's Kixi Palace banquet, you will come too." Ye Yang froze. Kixi Festival, what? Feng Luan had withdrawn his hand. Without explaining, he slowly sat down at the table and poured himself a cup of tea. Ye Yang looked at him, but suddenly remembered a major event in the plot of the original book. Feng Luan was so focused on government affairs in his early years that he rarely came to the harem. Until the day before the Kixi festival, he spent the night in the Chu Lian Palace, and then Chu Lian became pregnant and only favored the 6 palaces, so there was a follow-up in the text development of Yun Yang just drowned. Feng Luan went to spend the day and drink. This dog emperor. Ye Yang was angry, but he had doubts. Wait, then why is this dog emperor still here? But Feng Luan sat on the side drinking tea and didn't talk to him very much. When Kong Ning, who sent Chu Lian back, had returned, he still remained motionless. Ye Yang was really anxious, so he had to try his best to hint and ask, "Brother, is there something wrong with the emperor?" Feng Luan took a sip of tea and did not speak. "Ye Yang, if you have something to say, just say something, if you have nothing to do, just..." He simply closed his eyes and leaned on the bed, and said, "I just fell into the water and the frozen head hurts, can you stop it for a while and let me squint for a while?" Feng Luan put down the tea cup slowly. "Yun Shijun is ill, you really should rest well." Feng Luan said, "Kong Ning, I haven't finished reading the book today, and I will send it here." Ye Yang was silent for a long time, then he spoke with trembling, "Your Majesty, where are you going to rest tonight?" Feng Luan asked, "Is your accent back?" Ye Yang. As far as his favorability rating is 30, if he says a few more words, it will be cleared up. In this situation, how can he dare to make a fool of himself? Feng Luan lowered his eyes again, "You are not feeling well, and you have someone to make a soft couch, I will stay here overnight." Ye Yang was about to be moved, but Feng Luan added slowly, "It will save you from passing the anger to me." Ye Yang reluctantly twitched the corners of his mouth and said, "Your Majesty, if you go back, you won't be ready." Feng Luan, "I want to do it." Ye Yang. After Feng Luan said these words, Ye Yang watched the red letter +1 floating on his body and thought deeply. Why do you like it? Where is the joy of this tyrant? Your heart is unpredictable, he cannot understand it. Yun Yang was weak after years. Ye Yang lay on the bed for a while, but he actually fell asleep. When he woke up again, it was late at night. He was used to calling the palace servants, thinking about getting up and pouring himself a glass of water, but suddenly he heard a strange noise, which startled him. The voice seemed to be someone pressing an exclamation into his throat. Panicking in a hurry, Ye Yang lifted the teapot and looked around in horror, and it took a moment to confirm the source of the voice. It turned out to be that tyrant. The soft couch is on the outside of the hall, Feng Luan is lying flat on top, his hands are folded on his lower abdomen, his sleeping posture is neat and solemn, just like him, but at the moment he is sweating and breathing quickly, looks terrified, as if in a nightmare. He babbled. Ye Yang didn't know if he should wake him up, but the Emperor Go's sleep talk, if it is not properly preserved, involves the secrets of the court, it is better not to listen. He turned around slightly and was about to leave when he heard Feng Luan's trembling whisper. I have no choice. Feng Luan clenched the quilt, his face pale. You, don't hate me. Ya Yang couldn't help turning around and looked at Feng Luan again. He is good at everything, but he is nosy and a little gossip. He looked at Feng Luan's reaction, and felt that his dream would obviously not be a happy childhood memory, not sure what Au or Feng Luan's dream lover Bai Yueg Wang, the third concubine of the harem Qunjun is his incarnation. Although Feng Luan has only 3 people in his harem, it's a little bit less meaningful. The book never said that Feng Luan has any white moonlight, but this does not prevent this kind of double blood. The plot unfolded in his mind. He pricked up his ears, and just as he was about to listen a few more words, Feng Luan suddenly opened his eyes. The eyes of the two met. Ya Yang was a little embarrassed. Master Yun? Feng Luan asked, what are you doing here? He just woke up from the nightmare, breathing slightly, his voice was hoarse, and the sweat on his forehead was fine, and he was trying to calm down. But his expression had long since returned to normal, even more dangerous than usual indifference. The bottom of his eyes seemed to contain a chill, so Ya Yang first swallowed a mouthful of saliva, laughed dryly, and said, get up at night. Feng Luan was silent for a moment, and a red letter with diminished favor floated on his body. Feng Luan favorability 10, current favorability 21. Ya Yang panicked. He smiled stiffly and said dryly, thirsty. I'm thirsty, drink some water. After saying this, he directly raised the teapot, raised his head and poured a big mouthful of tea into the mouth of the teapot. He coughed non-stop, almost coughing up tears, the corners of his eyes were slightly flushed, and there was mist in his eyes. Ding! Feng Luan favorability +1, current favorability 22. Ya Yang. Ya Yang followed Feng Luan's line of sight and looked at himself. This jerk. I'm going to bed first, good night. Ya Yang reluctantly maintained his calm, turned his head and walked towards the bed mechanically, but he remembered the precarious favorability of the dog emperor, but he still counseled and added, your clothes are wet, change your clothes and go to sleep. Feng Luan was really startled, as if a little surprised, a little puzzled. Ya Yang looked at his expression, but felt that he might have said the wrong thing, and hurriedly changed his talent. The title of the sentence changed his words, you change your clothes and sleep. Feng Luan still frowned at him. Ya Yang had to continue to change his words, Your Majesty, you rest early. Feng Luan finally lowered his eyelashes slightly, his expression returned to the past, but Ya Yang did not see a change in his favor, but now it is victory if he does not lose. Ya Yang thought that the end would be a disaster, and was about to sneak back to rest, but Feng Luan stopped him. Feng Luan said, wait. Ya Yang stopped and turned his head stiffly. Come on, don't come again. Feng Luan raised his eyes to look at him, his tone was flat, as if he was saying an extremely ordinary thing, I want to take a bath and change clothes. Well, it's better to get up early and pack up. After he finished saying these words, Ya Yang saw that Feng Luan's favorability had dropped to 22 and increased by 1. He hurriedly nodded and agreed, turning around to go out and waiting for the waiter outside the door. The palace servants called in and ordered them to prepare hot water. Seeing that the people in the palace were busy coming and going, Ya Yang decided to take this opportunity to sneak away. A word came out. Yun Shijun, didn't Mama teach you? Feng Luan looked at his back and said word by word, husband bathing, you should stay here and wait for undressing. Ya Yang. Fug. Dog Emperor. Ya Yang felt that the tyrant's brain was really sick. But now the Emperor dog's goodwill towards him is in jeopardy, he really doesn't dare to resist too much, just take a bath. It's not that he hasn't given his father a bath in the big bathroom, since everyone it's a man, and the tyrant himself doesn't mind, so he has nothing to be afraid of. Kong Ning ordered the palace servants to arrange the hot water in the tub and waited aside. He wanted to have the palace servants come to serve, but Feng Luan glanced at Ya Yang who was standing beside him, and said, go on, let Yun Shijun come. Yang had to take a deep breath, tucked up his sleeves, looked up at Feng Luan, and asked, "Okay, where to rub?" Feng Luan raised his eyebrows slightly, spread his arms slightly, looked at Yang, and said, "Take off." Yang. Come on, it's the most exciting. Yang walked up to Feng Luan expressionlessly, lowered his head to untie the tie around Feng Luan's waist. The bedclothes were looser and simpler than other clothes. Otherwise, Yang really didn't know where to take it off, but as he got closer, he could smell the light scent of Feng Luan's body again. It happened today. The things that happened one after another appeared in front of him, and he was holding the tie of Feng Luan's bedclothes in his hand. His movements were slightly stiff, and the things going down seemed to be difficult. Untie the laces, then what? Does he have to help this dog emperor take off his pants? He raised his head and met Feng Luan's drooping eyes, as well as the change of favorability floating around Feng Luan. Feng Luan favorability +1, current favorability 24. Yang. Take off clothes to make you feel good? Stinker. Yang clenched his hands and gritted his teeth. He was worried that if he went with the flow at this time, his innocence would be lost, and the favorability of 24 was enough for him to do many things. The atmosphere is ambiguous, right? Then he will destroy this tyrant himself. Yang neatly tore off the belt around Feng Luan's waist. Seeing that his shirt was open, he didn't even look at it. With his big ballisty accent, he said carelessly, "Brother is doing well." Feng Luan. Yang didn't look sideways, grabbed the front of the nightgown and pulled it back, then threw it back and threw it on the screen, but after taking off his clothes, he was stunned. After the effect of the second-year illness, the wind was flying, and he didn't forget to continue to talk nonsense, saying, "How do you train all the muscles in your back? Teach me." Feng Luan. He watched Feng Luan's favorability level drop to 15, and felt that his goal had been achieved. The early autumn was cold. Yang felt that at this temperature, Feng Luan should not be able to stand naked for too long with his upper body, and he just said such a disappointing thing. Presumably Feng Luan would not want to hear it. He praised his good legs and buttocks. Such crazy words, such as Feng Luan, can't be listened to. Feng Luan was really silent for a moment, then spit out 4 words from his mouth, "No shame." Yang had a strategy in mind. "Then you just took off your clothes in front of so many people." Yang whispered, "You have no shame." Feng Luan, you. There are only 2 or 3 pieces of clothes, then you need the little palace maid to help you wear them. Yang said something, "You are not ashamed." Feng Luan. He saw that Feng Luan's face was pale with anger, and he consciously achieved his goal. He was very satisfied. Unexpectedly, Feng Luan stared at him gloomily for a long time, and then said leisurely, "Is Yun Shijun jealous?" Yang choked. Feng Luan's favorability +1, the current favorability is 16. Yang. No, what kind of magical brain circuit is this? Yang struggled to explain, "I'm not." Feng Luan's favorability +1, the current favorability is 17. Yang. Feng Luan said lightly, "Don't worry, Shijun Yun, I will come over when I have time." "This is not necessary." Yang was still in shock from the sudden turn of events, but the next moment, Feng Luan took his hand and pressed it lightly on his chest. Feng Luan had no strands on her upper body, and the two were skin-to-skin, and Feng Luan Su was standing for too long, and his body was slightly cold, which made Yang's palms feel hot, so hot like fire, it burned on his chest. Yang was stunned. It was the first time he was molested like this when he grew up. Of course it was impossible not to resist. Yang gritted his teeth and pulled his hand back. When he saw Feng Luan's 10 characters popping out beside him, he was so frightened that he immediately took the initiative to press his hand back. 7 points left. How does this play? Yankee reluctantly looked up at Feng Luan, smiled at Feng Luan, and said in a trembling voice, "Your Majesty, it's cold, Don't catch a cold. Feng Luan said, I have been specializing in riding and shooting since I was a child, and I am not a person with a fat brain. Ye Yang couldn't help but nodded, the emperor is tall and mighty, burly and strong, amazing. He looked up quietly, Feng Luan's favorability remained unchanged. Ye Yang had no choice but to bite the bullet and continue to talk nonsense. A handsome and dignified man like the emperor is really rare in the world, and he is indeed the real Dragon Emperor, the Lord of Destiny. Feng Luan said lightly, it's too much. He said so, but there was a small red letter of favor +1 floating on his body. Ye Yang suddenly realized that he would not wear flattery, even if it is such a stinky tyrant. He is also love listening to rainbow farts. No exaggeration. Your Majesty. I will never dare to lie. Ye Yang felt that he had grasped the magic weapon of his life, and he had long forgotten that his hand was still on Feng Luan's chest. In a hurry, he continued, you are a rare and wise king who is only concerned with government affairs. You seem to have stood up before the light of day today. It is truly breathtaking and moving. Feng Luan, what I do is just what the ancestors of all dynasties would do. It is precisely because the emperor and your ancestors are diligent in government affairs, benevolent in government and love the people that they are in today's prosperous world. Ye Yang said, I don't pick up things on the road, I don't close the house at night, and the people have plenty of food and clothing. I am lucky to be born in this world. Feng Luan. Feng Luan looked away, pressed Ye Yang's wrist by the way, and moved his hand away silently. Ding! Feng Luan favorability +10, current favorability 27. Look. Have a look. This good feeling brush is too easy. Ye Yang thinks he is really a genius. Ye Yang was a little surprised. With his ability to observe words and expressions, such as Feng Luan's wandering eyes, he doesn't know where to put his eyes. 9 times out of 10, he was praised to the point of embarrassment, but the status of a tyrant, the people around him flattering villains will never be less. Why is the young man who is rarely praised, he is shy when he makes a random compliment? Having said that, he still slipped out as soon as possible, and he had to keep his favorability level back to 27. If it is still early today, Ye Yang sees that there is not even a ray of light outside, and he does not know what time it is. He originally wanted to go back to sleep, but he stopped halfway through his steps. He turned around, silently found a chair and sat down. After leaving, he will go back to rest soon. But the emperor dog was too slow to take a bath. He sat for a while, feeling drowsy, and before he knew it, he leaned on the table and fell asleep. When Feng Luan finished packing, he came out and saw this scene. The beauty rested her head in one hand, the silk sleeve slipped to the crook of her arms, revealing a section of elbows as white as magnolias, with faint blue veins, which inevitably made people feel pity. He leaned on the small table above. It seems to have fallen asleep, but it is not stable, and this is obviously not a place to rest in peace. It was getting late. Feng Luan should have left the palace early. He knew that Ye Yang was trying to please him, so he stood in front of Ye Yang, raised his eyebrows slightly, and called, Yun Shai Jun. According to what he thought, if Yun Yang wanted to please him, he should wake up at this time, and then stared at him, pretending to be charming and saying why he fell asleep outside. But Ye Yang was still awake, and Feng Luan felt a little more impatient. He was thinking about how long this person could pretend, but heard Ye Yang speak slowly in a very low voice, like what are you talking about? Feng Luan frowned slightly, took a step forward, wanted to hear more clearly, and called out, Master Yun. Beauty's eyelashes moved slightly, her lips were luscious and moist. Feng Luan was getting closer, she couldn't help but think of the feeling of touching those soft lips today. He hesitated a little, but still stretched out his hand and gently he stroked the side of the beauty's face, but he didn't want Ye Yang to suddenly open his lips and just put his fingers in his mouth. The soft and warm touch from the fingertips made Feng Luan's breathing stagnate, and the tip of the tongue slipped through the fingertips. Bursts of numbness. Feng Luan frowned slightly, and was about to step back. Ye Yang clicked his tongue lightly, sucked his finger, and put it in his mouth again. Feng Luan's voice was slightly dull and hoarse, and he frowned and called out, Yun Shi. Ye Yang took a bite, and then spat out his fingers without hesitation. Bah, what the is this? Ye Yang murmured, what the original chicken, it's really unpalatable. Feng Luan. Feng Luan looked at his hand, there was a very clear tooth mark on his finger, although there was no bleeding, but there was a layer of red bruises. He was silent for a moment, then looked towards the culprit in this matter, saw Ye Yang lightly opening his lips and muttering in his mouth. Don't grab my chicken legs. Ye Yang smashed his mouth hard, no, I can't eat any more, I'm going to die. Feng Luan. Feng Luan gritted his teeth and said angrily, Yun Yang. Ye Yang suddenly woke up from his sweet dream, staring blankly at Feng Luan in front of him, and the large characters that appeared on Feng Luan's body. Feng Luan favorability level 25, current favorability level 2. Ye Yang. What's wrong? What happened? Why did it suddenly drop so much? Feng Luan raised his finger angrily and pointed at him, remember me. Ye Yang. Remember what? What has he done? Feng Luan has already left with a flick of his sleeves, leaving Ye Yang blank. What's the matter? How can I only get 2 favorability points after I finally brushed it back? How can he still play? Ye Yang himself didn't understand what was going on, he muttered to himself, I don't know either. If his favorability is lower than 0, his life is in danger, and now his life is on the line, but he still doesn't know how to save it. Mother Li hurriedly closed the door and ducked into the house, saying, Don't panic, little master, this servant has another plan. Ye Yang. He couldn't help thinking of that jade power. This must not be a good strategy. Mother Li took the luggage she brought over, rummaged for a while, took out another item, and handed it to Ye Yang solemnly, saying, Little son. There will be a brilliant tomorrow. Ye Yang looked down at the thing in his hand. It was a thin booklet with nothing on the cover, and when he opened the first page with trembling hands, he saw 5 large characters written in black and white. Spring Night Secret Drama. Ye Yang. Ye Yang sent Mammy Li away, then stuffed the booklet that Mama Li desperately made him leave under the pillow, and fell on the bed, only to feel that life was difficult. This is only the first day, but he feels as if he has been tired for months. Daliang, someone from the palace came to report, Yun Yang's brother Yun Rin entered the palace early in the morning, and is now waiting outside the palace to be summoned. After all, Yun Yang has entered the palace as a servant, and he cannot meet his parents and elder brothers at will. Kong Ning, the head of the internal supervisor, ordered 2 little eunuchs to monitor and look after him outside. Yi leaned against the head of the bed, waiting for Yun Rin to come in. Ye Yang remembered that Yun Rin was the general Feng Luan relied on, and Yun Yang was his only younger brother. Feng Luan was blamed for this matter, and then a quarrel gradually developed, and finally he was transferred to Mobei, and rarely returned to Beijing. He is not Yun Yang. Seeing Yun Rin's anxious expression, he didn't know what to do for a while, so he lowered his head temporarily and listened to Yun Rin's words. Yun Rin sat down beside his bed and asked, Who did it? Ye Yang. Ye Yang knew that Yun Rin was asking about Yun Yang's falling into the water. Although he knew that the person behind the scenes was Chu Lian, he didn't have any proof. Of course, he could only whisper that he didn't know, but Yun Rin, unable to bear, he raised his eyebrows slightly, and asked, You can't say that your foot slipped down for a while, right? Ye Yang was speechless. Yun Rin asked again, What's the matter with amnesia? Ye Yang. When he deceived Feng Luan, he felt no guilt, and even felt that everything was taken for granted, but things were different when it was Yun Rin's turn. Seeing that he was silent, Yun Rin sighed softly. I know you don't like fighting with others. Yun Rin said, It's just that in this palace, people who don't have the sacred heart. He frowned slightly, as if remembering something, and kept his mouth shut. After a while, Fang smiled and wanted to reach out and touch Ya Yang's head, but he felt that the two of them with his current status, this move is too far-fetched. He withdrew his hand, his tone was gentle, full of consolation, and said, "It doesn't matter, you just live in the biggest house in the world, it doesn't matter if you don't get the favor of the Sacred Heart." "Ya Yang, there is a brother here." Yunrin whispered to him, "Don't be afraid, no one can bully you." "Ya Yang." Ya Yang felt guilty again, he thought it was just a book, except him, everyone else should be dummies living in the book, but Yunrin's words are flesh and blood, which is like an illusory thing. He thought of his sister and was speechless. What happened to the Yun family in the original book? He remembered clearly, Yunyang fell into the water and died, while the Chu family eliminated the foreign party in the dynasty. Yunrin was transferred to the border, and he was hurt. Father Yun then he lost his phase and left Beijing to return to his hometown, but he couldn't take the youngest son's corpse with him, and Micah was thinking about it and became sick. What happened next? Certainly not so good. Now that Yunyang is gone, and he lives on Yunyang's body again, Yunyang seems to be kind to him, so he will naturally try his best to protect Yun's family. Do your best, and you have to seek the rest of your life for them. Seeing that he was silent, Yunrin thought he didn't like to talk about these things, so he cleared his throat, deliberately chose a lighter topic, and said, "Ah Yang, what have you been watching recently?" Book. Yunyang is frail, and he often reads some idle books when he is bored at home. Yunrin used to talk about this with him, but now when he opens his mouth, Ya Yang can't help but think of what Li Mami brought. Spring night secret drama. I was at a loss for words, and after a while, I murmured, "It's all kinds of miscellaneous books." A few days ago, my father found several ancient books that were lost. Yunrin said, "I will ask someone to bring it into the palace tomorrow." Ya Yang nodded. Yunrin said a few words to him again. He stayed too long, Ya Yang was sick, he had to get up and leave, so that Ya Yang could rest, and Ya Yang wanted to get up facing each other, he was still ill after all. When he rolled over and got out of bed, he felt dizzy and almost fell with weak legs. Yunrin hurriedly supported him and said, "You are sick, you don't have to send me out." Before he finished speaking, Ya Yang had already stepped on the corner of the quilt and almost took the whole quilt off the bed. And the things he hid under his pillow before going to bed yesterday. Spring night secret drama. Ya Yang. He was terrified and wanted to kick the book back, but Yunrin held his arm. He was dizzy and weak, unable to move, and Yunrin had already seen the book on the ground. While he kicked him, he helped him back to the bed, reached out to pick up the book, and asked him with a smile, "This is the book you read these days?" Ya Yang wanted to reach out and grab it, but Yunrin had already opened the book. Ya Yang was speechless. For a moment, Yunrin's smile froze on his face and looked up at him. "Ya Yang." "Yunlin." "Ya Yang, brother, listen to my explanation. This is the miscellaneous book you read." Yunrin's voice trembled. "Ah Yang, tell the truth. Did the emperor force you to read it? Did he bully you?" Ya Yang, wait, this seems to be going wrong." Yunrin threw the book to the ground and cursed in anger. Darkness. Ya Yang never expected that this pot would eventually fall on Feng Luan's head. He saw Yunrin's face full of sullen anger, obviously because Feng Luan forced his pure and polite younger brother to look at this kind of lewd/evil and debauched album. Rin's mood, but he still remembered that there were 2 little Huangman guards sent by Feng Luan outside at the moment, and they should be able to hear every word they said. And Yunrin scolded Feng Luan Huangjun. "No matter what dynasty or generation, this is obviously a crime of great treason. The title of this book mentions tyrants." Rin's words fell into the hands of others, and almost the moment Yunrin spoke, he hurriedly raised his tone, trying to cover Yunrin's voice. "Big brother!" he shouted, "Dark, the marriage army is good. The marriage is centrally arranged by the army, innovative, festive. lively. Yunlin. Yunrin is not a fool. He opened his mouth in anger for a while, and knew that Feng Luan would not punish him for scolding him, but even so, this sentence is obviously not free to talk nonsense. He shut his mouth, a little annoyed, and when he looked at Ye Yang again, he saw Ye Yang took a few deep breaths, as if he was making a difficult decision. This book, he didn't force me. Ye Yang said reluctantly, it's me. He was at a loss for words. With Yunrin's character, he was very worried that Yunrin would run to find Feng Luan's troubles. He had to cut off the troubles of this matter, then what he had to do was to take the initiative to put the blame on take it in your own arms. Ye Yang lowered his voice. This matter has nothing to do with the emperor. Ye Yang said, brother, this is, me and his. Yunrin froze slightly. Ye Yang suppressed his tone, forced himself to be shy, and forced out the next sentence. Boudoir delights. Yunlin. Feng Luan finished dealing with the affairs of the court, and before returning to the palace to pass the meal, he saw Libu, a maid sent by the Queen Mother, standing beside the door, asking him to choose a concubine who would serve in the night. Feng Luan has a headache. He was thinking about what excuse to make today to refuse, when he saw Corning winking at him outside the door, as if he had something to say to him in private. Corning has been by his side since childhood. He has 100% trust in Corning. He thought it was an important matter, so he asked Corning to come forward first, and he wanted to listen to Corning. He got up at the same time yesterday, and he didn't rest well at night. He had an old problem. He only felt a twitching pain in the forehead. He took a sip from the teacup, saw Kong Ning grit his teeth in anger, and asked calmly, "What's the matter?" Kong Ning felt that this matter was secret, so he lowered his voice and whispered to Feng Luan, "Your Majesty, it's that Yun Shijun again." Feng Luan. Corning, he actually lied about you. He said you. Said you. Corning can't go on. Feng Luan had an ominous feeling in her heart. General Yun entered the palace this morning and found a book by the side of Yun Shijun's bed. Kong Ning muttered that word as if biting his own tongue. Yun Shijun said that this book was read by you, the emperor, with him. Feng Luan felt that something was wrong. He hesitated and asked, "What book is he reading?" Feng Luan was puzzled. Corning was embarrassed. Secret play. Feng Luan frowned. What? Corning, Yan. Yan Shu. Feng Luan could not hear clearly. He seldom saw Kong Ning look like a mother-in-law and mother, and he was upset with a headache, so he said bluntly, "Kong Ning, I can't hear you clearly, please speak up." Kong Ning was stunned for a moment. He didn't understand Feng Luan's will now, but he always obeyed all Feng Luan's orders unconditionally, so he raised his voice suddenly, closed his eyes and said simply, "Your Majesty. The waiter said that you took him to read Yunshu together." Feng Luan. Feng Luan's hand holding the teacup trembled slightly. She looked up to the door, but she saw the maid next to the Queen Mother with a smile that was not a smile, and cast a look at him that a servant knows. The rest of the palace staff looked at their noses, and seemed to pretend that they had never heard their conversations, but with Feng Luan's understanding of the deep palace, he and Yunyang had a romantic relationship in the afternoon. The affair will spread to every corner of the harem. For a long time, Feng Luan took a deep breath. "Kong Ning, go talk to the people sent by the Queen Mother." He tried to restrain himself, but he couldn't restrain his voice trembling slightly, gritted his teeth word by word, "Tonight, Ling, Yun, Shi, Jun, wait, sleep." Ye Yang sent away the lost Yun Lin, and his mood became more and more complicated. He didn't know if the two little eunuchs would report what he said with Yun Rin to Feng Luan, but if they did, I'm afraid that Feng Luan's favorability has fallen to the bottom. It will fall further, and now Feng Luan's affection for him may only be negative. Ye Yang lay back on the bed. Maybe because of the intensified wind chill, he felt more and more dizzy, while trying to recall the large paragraph of instructions that the system finally jumped out of the book. Anyway, he read a lot of strange novels when he was recovering from illness, and quickly accepted everything in front of him, thinking that he had nothing to worry about anyway, and he couldn't give up this chance to live again. But now Feng Luan's favorability has fallen to the bottom, and the system tells that once Feng Luan's favorability drops below zero, this dog emperor is likely to kill him. He was in a state of turmoil, when Li Mama suddenly flew in from the outside, stood by the door and shouted at him, "Little young master! Ba, Yun Shai Jun!" Great joy! Ye Yang looked at her with doubts. Isn't Mama Lia teaching Mama? Why are you still staying in his palace and not leaving? Before he opened his mouth to ask, he saw a young father-in-law walk in with a happy face, and said loudly, "Yun Shai Jun, happy event!" Ye Yang! Ye Yang felt that he understood. Does this dog emperor want him to sleep? As a steadfast straight man, Ye Yang has a headache. He must refuse to serve the bed, but Feng Luan's affection for him is already so low, if he refuses again, he is afraid that Feng Luan will kill him on the spot. He looked at the happy faces of the father-in-law and Li Ma, and suddenly remembered that today was the Kixi festival, there was a palace banquet in the palace, and Feng Luan ordered him to participate, which means, as long as if you work hard enough at the palace banquet, there is still a chance to save the emperor's favor. It's just that this dog emperor's favor point is a bit too weird. So far, except for Rainbow Fart, he has not found a way to brush the tyrant's favor. Ye Yang, dangerous! The sky is about to fall, and someone came to invite Ye Yang to move to the Kixi Palace banquet. Ye Yang sat drowsy beside the bed, feeling as if he was getting sicker. Originally it was just a little Feng Han, but now he reached out and touched his forehead, and he could feel the heat on his forehead, but he could only insist on going to the palace banquet with the people who came. He was still early, and he was seated. Sitting down, he rubbed his forehead and recalled the story that was supposed to happen tonight in the original book. The Tanabata Palace Banquet. Concubines and concubines fight cleverly, needles pierce the moon. Halfway through the banquet, people in the palace perform arts, Chu Lian dances the city, attracting Feng Luan's attention, but all these things are related to it doesn't matter to him, which means that tonight he just needs to eat melons quietly and blow a few rainbow farts to the tyrant by the way. While thinking about it, he raised his head and saw Chu Lian, the heroine of the book, appearing. When he met in the palace before, he was full of the jade power at Feng Luan's feet, and he did not pay attention to Chu Lian's his own goodwill, but now he looked up and saw Chu Lian's goodwill towards him at a glance. Chu Lian's current favorability rating, 121 Ye Yang. What did he do to make Chu Lian hate him so much? From behind, Kong Ning shouted that the emperor is coming. Ye Yang hurriedly sat upright, turned his head to the side, and happened to meet Feng Luan's cold eyes looking at him, and the constant jumping out of Feng Luan's body. Big red letters. Feng Luan favorability 11111, current favorability 17 Ye Yang. Hey? Why do you fall in love with him? Ye Yang's pleasing smile to Feng Luan completely collapsed on his face. Now that he is too far away from Feng Luan, there is no way to flatter Feng Luan. He can only minimize his sense of existence, lest Feng Luan feel upset when he sees him, and then inexplicably lose some goodwill just bad. The Tanabata Palace Banquet is not a big event, Concubine Shen is not coming due to illness, and the Queen Mother does not like to be lively. Now all the main characters are on the stage, the palace banquet has already started. Ye Yang concentrates on eating. Anyway, begging for cleverness has nothing to do with him. He ate happily, but from time to time he felt a dazzling stare from the side. It was obviously Feng Luan. Ye Yang is very guilty. But the roast goose at the palace banquet was so delicious that he ignored Feng Luan's gaze and watched the rest of the palace maids wear needles and fight skillfully under pressure. Lian was eager to try. She had practiced the exotic dance for a long time, only to be presented to Feng Luan today. Ye Yang's mouth was full of roast goose. He raised his head blankly, and subconsciously responded, "Hey! Feng Luan!" When Feng Luan saw him eating goose, he remembered the finger he was bitten on last night. He was full of anger and let out a cold snort, saying, I heard that Yun Shijun has no qin, chess, calligraphy and painting. If you are not good, Concubine Chu wants to dance, so why not ask Yun Shijun to play the qin? Ya Yang. This dog emperor knows that he has amnesia, but still wants him to play the piano? Isn't this just to make him look ugly? Ya Yang, Your Majesty, I Fengluan Favorability 1, Current Favorability 18 Ya Yang, I can sing and dance. Tell me, what do you want me to play? Chu Lian prides herself on her outstanding dancing skills. The accompaniment is only an accompaniment after all. If she can't steal her limelight, she just smiled slightly, her expression quite arrogant, and asked, Yun Shijun, what song do you want to play? Ya Yang was a little embarrassed. I think Sister Chu dances gracefully, like a wind music, let's play it. Chu Lian was not afraid at all, and asked, flute or xiao? Ya Yang, not at all. Chu Lian frowned slightly, is that Suan? Ya Yang bit the bullet and said softly, Suana, Suana. Chu Lian. Ya Yang did learn some Suana, but when he was young, he learned a little from his grandfather. He watched Chu Lian posing for a dance on the field, raised the Suana in his hand tremblingly, and blew the first note. Chu Lian slipped her foot and almost fell on the spot. She looked back and looked at him in shock, but she was shocked to realize that Fengluan was staring at the two of them at this time. Before jumping out 2 steps, the sound of the Suana suddenly floated, and the sound was blown away. Chu Lianting didn't, nor did she dance. She paused in an awkward position for a long time. Fang Ting Ya Yang blew the tone just now. She gritted her teeth, the original graceful and charming exotic dance. Abruptly, she jumped out of the chilling air, and all the charming glances turned into sharp blades, straight at Ya Yang. Fengluan was choking on the wine and was coughing so badly. Kong Ning hurriedly cheered him up and said, Your Majesty, this servant Yun is just making a fool of yourself. But before Kong Ning finished speaking, he saw Fengluan bend his lips slightly. He seemed to have to hold back the smile, but Ya Yang blew an unstable long note, and Chu Lian stumbled, and Fengluan couldn't help but let out a low laugh. When the rest of the banquet saw the emperor laughing, they immediately followed suit, accompanied by Ya Yang's sparse Suana sound. The palace banquet was suddenly full of people. Happy breath! Ya Yang's heart is bitter. He hadn't touched this thing for too long, and even he felt ashamed, but except for Chu Lian, everyone at the palace banquet seemed to be very happy. When he sat back on his seat again, Fengluan waved at him and asked him to come closer to talk. Ya Yang was excited. He couldn't wait to carry his stool and jump over immediately, but he still remembered that Fengluan didn't like to escape, so he forced himself to walk slowly over and said softly, What is the emperor's order? Fengluan turned his head slightly, looked up at him, and asked, Is this what Yun Xiang taught you? Ya Yang. Fengluan was in a very good mood, raised his hand to order the palace servants to pour wine, and said, You are quite interesting. What's the use of being interesting? You give me a good impression. Ya Yang was about to speak, but felt a flicker of cold light. He looked up, and saw that the palace servant named Fengluan was pouring wine with a sharp edge in his sleeve, and a fierce light in his eyes. Ya Yang has subconsciously grasped Fengluan's wrist, pulled him to his side, and without hesitation moved forward to block Fengluan behind him. He didn't think much about it, all his actions were just a conditioned reflex of years of work, but he forgot that Yunyang's body was weak, far from the physique he trained in the past. He pulled Fengluan hard, and he almost stumbled. Then he felt a sharp pain in his shoulders. Instead, Fengluan wrapped his arms around his waist and stepped back a few steps to avoid the assassin's blade. The guards rushed up. Ya Yang wanted to look back, but felt dizzy. The pain behind the shoulder was excruciating, and if there was a fire, he was full of cold sweat, faintly feeling that something was wrong. Is it so painful? Corning has exclaimed, The knife is poisonous. Ya Yang. The palace banquet was a mess. Yang finally turned his head to look at his shoulders. The front of his clothes was stained with blood, and he was a little dizzy, and there was noise in front of him. He couldn't hold back and muttered softly, said, "Oh my God, why is there so much blood, am I dying?" Feng Luan took him in his arms with a complicated expression, and after a while he said softly, "Don't worry, I won't let you die." Yang was already in a state of confusion. He could see the number that added favor to Feng Luan's head jumping over, but his eyes were blurred, like a layer of veil. He couldn't really see how much it was, opened his lips slightly for a long time, his voice trembling, but insisted on saying the next sentence. Feng Luan frowned, wanting to hear what he had to say. "Yes. Be nice to the Imperial physician." Yang slowly closed his eyes. "Study medicine is not easy, just do it and cherish it. Don't let the Imperial physician be buried with you." Feng Luan. Yang didn't know what poison he was in. Before he finished speaking, his arm hurt, and when he opened his eyes, he saw Feng Luan pinching his arm. A sentence, "You are domestic violence." Feng Luan raised his eyebrows, as if he didn't understand the meaning of this sentence, just coldly instructed, "Don't sleep." Yang opened his eyes. He didn't want to sleep, but he couldn't stand the eyelids fighting, and the Imperial doctor was very anxious, looked at Feng Luan a little embarrassedly, and said, "Your Majesty, here." Feng Luan has raised the tone knowingly, "Kong Ning, let everyone else go down." Convenient. Kong Ning thought Yang was not pleasing to the eye at first, but now Yang sacrificed his life to save Feng Luan, then he was also his benefactor. He sweated profusely, and turned his head high without hesitation, shouting, ordering the rest of the people to temporarily avoid it, and ordering the Imperial army to guard the entrance of the stairs, and then hurried back. The terrifying wounds on the shoulders were blood-stained and blackened. The Imperial doctor wiped away the poisonous blood for him, and took out a small bag full of slender silver needles used for acupuncture. Yang happened to look back and saw a classic episode of a TV series in his mind, and he said with a trembling voice, Your name." The Imperial physician was concentrating on roasting the silver needles, and Feng Luan responded directly for him, saying, "His surname is wrong." Yang Tai Rong showed the silver needle and said, "Your Majesty, it may hurt a little." "I know." Yang's mind was in chaos, and he seemed to have lost his mind, just muttered, "Even if I call him long live, it's useless." Imperial physician wrong, Feng Luan. For a moment, Feng Luan raised his hand, causing Yang to lean his head in his arms. "It won't hurt." Feng Luan is rare in such a gentle tone. Yang almost thought he heard it wrong. He forced himself, raised his head and looked at Feng Luan, looking for the line of words related to favorability. Then he saw Feng Luan's current favorability rating is 32. Yang. Blocking a knife increases 50 favorability. This directly pulled him back from the death line of negative favorability. He was a little more energetic, escaped from death, and his heart was moved beyond words. Just as he was about to speak, Imperial physician Rong had dropped a needle from his hand, and a silver needle pierced his shoulder. Yang screamed in pain, "Grass!" Feng Luan. Yang. He raised his head for a while, and saw the half-pulled moon hanging high on the Kixi festival outside the tall buildings. Yang, the sky, turns the world upside down, the father hurts, harms. He saw Feng Luan's face becoming more and more gloomy, and then thinking about his only remaining 32 goodwill and the speed of Feng Luan's loss, he didn't dare to say any more. He just bit the bullet and closed his eyes, and put his head directly buried in Feng Luan's arms. After a long time, the Imperial doctor breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Your Majesty, it's all right." Yang hurriedly struggled to pull the clothes on his shoulders, but Feng Luan reached out to arrange his clothes for him, and then hugged him horizontally. Yang was taken aback. He had never been picked up in this position before, and no matter how weak Yun Yang was, he was still a man, but Feng Luan seemed to be holding it quite easily. He was a little embarrassed and hurriedly said, "Your Majesty, I'll just go by myself." "Follow him." Ye Yang was a little scared. Fortunately, the sedan chair was ready, so it stopped on the outside, and Feng Luan did not ride with him. When his feet landed and wanted to climb on the sedan chair by himself, he felt his legs it was soft on the top, as if it was a little difficult to even stand firm. He really didn't expect the Kixi Palace banquet to be like this, but there is no such accident in the book. After Yunyang fell into the water, the palace repeatedly interrogated the murderer, and people panicked for a while. Perhaps because of this, the assassin was frightened, and the matter was rooted out. He has only been in the book for 2 days, the plot of the original book has changed a lot. Chu Lian is not favored, let alone pregnant, and he has become Chu Lian's #1 enemy. He simply can't imagine how the plot will develop next. No, he has to get the plot back on track. Ye Yang suddenly realized. At this time, he should try his best to match Chu Lian and Feng Luan. When I came to visit here, Ye Yang was hesitating to see whether or not to see it, and another little palace maid ran in, stammered nervously, and said, "Your Majesty, the Emperor is back." Ye Yang. Feng Luan's favorability rating was only 32, so he dared not go away, but if he saw Feng Luan, then Chu Lian and Shen Xiangning would naturally be seen together. But Chu Lian's favor with him is now 171. He sees Feng Luan again, but if he doesn't keep Chu Lian will lose his favor. Then the question is, how can he make Chu Lian happy without making Feng Luan lose too much favor? It's so difficult to send a proposition. He is still struggling with a headache, and several people who came to visit have walked in together. Ye Yang could see clearly. Kong Ning held several brocade boxes and handed them over to the palace servants, which seemed to be gifts from Feng Luan. Ye Yang thought nervously. No one in the palace knows that Feng Luan likes gentle and quiet elegant beauties. If he is too weak and quiet at the moment, Chu Lian will definitely think that he is pretending to be miserable to win the Sacred Heart. He has to do it the other way around. Anyway, Feng Luan still has a favorability rating of 32. He is a little bit dead, so it shouldn't be a big problem. Feng Luan asked, "Is Yun Shijun feeling better today?" Before he finished speaking, Ye Yang started to answer with a thick voice. "Ye Yang, oh, brother, why do you bring something when you come here? Do is your own family, so you are polite." Feng Luan. Chu Lian. As expected, the numbers of the increase and decrease of their favorability floated above their heads at the same time. Feng Luan favorability +1, current favorability 33. Chu Lian favorability 1, current favorability 173. Ye Yang. Wait, is there something wrong? Why is this tyrant still more favorable? Not happy, of course she wants to be happy. Feng Luan's expression was flat. Ye Yang couldn't see much of his emotions, he could only sigh deeply, while guessing in his heart what was going on. There is something wrong with Feng Luan. When he was speaking in dialect, Feng Luan obviously lost his favor. How could he gain favor after he blocked a knife for Feng Luan? Could it be that? After he rescued the dog emperor was quite moved, and even looked at him pleasing to the eye? He was in a heavy heart, and suddenly someone came to report that the maid of honor beside the Queen Mother had arrived here. The Queen Mother, Ye Yang didn't dare to turn her away, and when people came in, he bowed to them, and before explaining the purpose of his visit, Feng Luan opened his mouth slowly, said, "You don't need to ask more, I am resting at Yun Shijun today." Before he finished speaking, he added 5 favor points to himself, and seemed very satisfied with his decision. Ye Yang was frightened, and hurriedly said, "Your Majesty, I am sick." Feng Luan, more personal care. Chu Lian. Chu Lian favorability 20, current favorability 193. Ye Yang covered his face with one hand and was speechless. The Empress Dowager frowned slightly and took orders to leave, but before retreating, she gave Ye Yang a slightly warning look. Ye Yang could see clearly, but he didn't know why. Chu Lian was in a bad mood, but Chen Xiangning was still very happy. Seeing Ye Yang looking at her, she even winked at Ye Yang. This harem is too complicated for Ye Yang to penetrate. Chu Lian couldn't sit down anymore. She stayed for a moment, got up to say goodbye. Chen Xiangning also smiled and left, and only Feng Luan and Ye Yang were left in the palace, and Ye Yang was in a complicated mood, waiting for the palace staff to bring it today the medicine. Feng Luan said softly, "There are dozens of dead guards around me, if there is another next time, you just need to take care of yourself." Ye Yang replied casually, "You think I am willing to save you? I am just doing justice and serving the people, and the red scarf on my chest is old and bright." After he finished saying this sentence, he paused, and couldn't help but mutter in a low voice, "But you are not the people. You are the three mountains that are pressing on the people, the class the struggle has to give you 5 black categories." Feng Luan frowned slightly, he seemed to be used to Ye Yang's nonsense, and he was in a good mood today, so he went on to say, "You have a good rest today, if your body has any in your spare time, you should also practice hard." His words touched Ye Yang's heart. Yunyang's body is too weak. He also wants to exercise to keep fit. Looking at this Imperial garden, it is very large and can be used as a training ground. Ye Yang couldn't help nodding, but he didn't want Feng Luan to continue to ask, "What do you want to learn?" Ye Yang was startled, "What do you learn?" "Feng Luan, what do you want to learn? I will teach you." Ye Yang. Ye Yang looked at Feng Luan 38's favorability rating, and then thought of the strange setting that he seemed to add favorability to Feng Luan no matter what he said, it was equivalent to his death-saving gold medal, it seemed no matter how he acted as a demon, Feng Luan would never kill him. Ye Yang has always been very experimental. Ye Yang cleared his throat vigorously, "Learn, then the whole chest will be broken." Feng Luan. Ding! Feng Luan favorability rating 1, current favorability rating 37. What is unpredictable monarchy? This is unpredictable monarchy. Just now, no matter what he said, he liked it, and it started to fall in the blink of an eye. Ye Yang and Feng Luan looked at each other, Feng Luan suddenly sneered, and said, "Break a big stone in your chest? How about you learn to break a big stone in your chest?" Ye Yang, "No, no." Feng Luan raised his eyebrows and asked him, "What do you want to learn?" Ye Yang. He pondered carefully, remembering that Feng Luan had said something to him before. Feng Luan said that he specialized in riding and archery since he was a child, and now he is still obediently admitting it, picking up what Feng Luanhui has to say is better. Ye Yang answered honestly, "I want to learn to ride and shoot." Feng Luan's mood seems to have finally improved, "When you are healed, I will teach you." Ye Yang. The Dog Emperor. He just scolded in his heart, Feng Luan stood up suddenly, making him shrink back in fright, but Feng Luan just asked Kong Ning to send him the unread book, he seemed to be sure of tonight to rest here, Ye Yang hopes that he can leave as soon as possible. Although he couldn't make Feng Luan go after Chu Lian, he had a way to make the tyrant leave because he hated him. This tyrant loves elegant and weak beauties. He loves faces, not people. If the elegant beauties do something extremely indecent, Feng Luan should immediately lose his love for him. Interest. Ye Yang thought so, he simply climbed to the edge of the bed and looked down at his legs. The big guy with his feet is the essence of all rough guys. He doesn't believe that Luan can have sex/interest with a person who is rocking flip-flops on Erlang's legs. Ye Yang just woke up, wearing only pajamas, no shoes, and socks. He probed into the bed and looked under the bed, there was a pair of low-top upturned cloth shoes, very delicate, he moved to the bed and stepped on the back of the shoe. No flip-flops, cloth shoes should be fine. Feng Luan remained silent, but his eyes chased his actions, and when he saw him put his feet into his shoes, he spoke lightly and asked, "Yun Shai Jun, what are you doing?" Ye Yang sat on the edge of the bed, spread his legs, and put the other leg on his knees, thinking he was looking rough, and began to shake his legs. He was only wearing a singlila or bedclothes, made of good materials, like silk. With his movements, the trousers slipped up, revealing a calf and slender ankles. The cloth shoes kankan hangs on the tiptoe. The color is gorgeous, and it is shaky, which makes his skin white as snow, and the faint blue veins are hidden. Yang didn't realize it yet. He was shaking his legs and shoes, and was about to stretch out his hand to make a foot-picking movement, but found that the opposite Fengluan looked at him, as if something was wrong. Yang lowered his head and looked at his legs. The exposed calf is thin and white, and the cloth shoes are like high heels hanging on the toes in the photo. Yang! Wait, why does Yunyang have no leg hair? How can you not be a rough man? Have leg hair. If he had hairy legs, this performance would be twice the result with half the effort. He could scare Fengluan away on the spot, but now he's making his feet like a lure. He can't do this. He has to hurry up, find a way to dilute the current ambiguous atmosphere. Yang, brother, have you eaten yet? Fengluan. Yang put down his legs embarrassedly, tore off his trousers, looked at Fengluan, and reluctantly regained some confidence. I'm starving, and there's nothing left for us, just some cabbage clams. Potato chips, why don't you stew? Let's cook, let's make it on the hour. Fengluan. Fengluan raised his hand and took the book from Corning, but he was still calm. His favorability didn't change. He just frowned slightly, and said with disgust, "You really should study hard. Palace etiquette." But when he mentioned the word ceremony in the palace, he couldn't help but think of Li Ma and Nau Shi. His brows could not help but wrinkle a little tighter, and said in a low voice, "No shame." Before he finished speaking, he paused again, remembering Yang's refutation of his words that day. He couldn't help swallowing the end of the sentence, snorted slightly displeased, raising his eyebrows. He looked at Kong Ning and asked, "Where is Auntie Shu?" Kong Ning replied, "It should still be in the palace of Lord Yunqi." Change 1. Fengluan glanced at Yang's leg and said, "This is all about teaching." Yang was nervous for a moment. The book makes it clear that Fengluan is a tyrant who can kill even his own brother. He said that he wanted to change the teaching mammy. Could it be that he wanted to kill Li Mama? Yang hurriedly said, "Your Majesty, Mammy Li didn't make a big mistake, please think twice." Fengluan gave him a sideways look, "What do you think I'm going to do?" Yang, He murmured for a moment, feeling unspeakable embarrassment in his heart, so he hurriedly looked away, tried to change the topic, and asked, "Your Majesty, what happened to the assassin last night?" Fengluan turned over a page and said lightly, "Kill it." Yang, doesn't you need interrogation?" Fengluan replied, "I already know who he is." Yang looked at him curiously, but Fengluan stopped talking. Compared with the happy mood when he was joking with him before, Fengluan's expression seemed to be a little colder, and he did not talk to him anymore. When he spoke, he just looked at the memorial in his hand, and he didn't turn to the next page for a long time. Yang shut up. This is obviously not something he should know. He really shouldn't talk too much. When he saw that Fengluan didn't want to talk to him again, he simply lay down on his side without saying a word, and waited for the meal and the medicine. He soon fell asleep again. Just as he was about to close his eyes and go to sleep again, he heard Fengluan muttering, and he seemed to be in a nightmare again. Yang hugged the quilt and turned over silently. But he remembered Fengluan's ravings in his dream last time, and couldn't help but be curious again. Who is Au in Fengluan's mouth? The next day dawned. When Yang woke up, Fengluan had already gone to court. He was drinking medicine, but when he turned his head, he saw Mammy Li leaning on the door frame and looking at him tearfully. Yang snorted in his heart, and was shocked. "Little young master! The slaves are leaving!" Madame Li shouted, "The emperor has ordered, the slaves can no longer be with you. Yang, ah! He remembered the pictures of the jade situation and the spring night secret opera that Mama Li gave him, and wished Mama Li would go faster. But he never imagined that Mammy Li dragged out a little maid from behind and put the treasure bag in her boudoir on the little maid's neck. The heavy bag dragged the little girl. She stumbled, and Li Ma looked up at Yang with teary eyes, and said, "Little master, Wanjuan is an apprentice taught by the slaves, so let Wanjuan follow you in the future." Yang, this is not necessary. Wanjuan was pushed forward by Mammy Li, and bowed sharply to Yang, making Yang take a few steps back. The slave has studied it carefully, the matter of grace is in the body and mind. Wanju raised her head, looked at Yang, nervous, and stammered, New slave must be, it will help the little boy win the sacred heart." Yang felt his head hurt even more. He looked at the two with their eager eyes, suddenly remembered something, grabbed Mammy Li's arm, and asked, "Mammy Li, how long have you been in the palace?" Mother Li patted her chest and assured, "The slaves have been in the palace for more than 20 years, and that is watching the emperor grow up. What the emperor likes, the slaves all know." Yang didn't want to know Feng Luan's preferences, he was more curious about Feng Luan's dreams. He wanted to rush to ask the matter clearly before Mama Li left, so he lowered his voice and asked, Do you know who in the palace calls you by name, or if it has a name in it? A transcendental one." Before she finished speaking, Mammy Li could not wait to raise her hand to cover his mouth, her face full of horror. She lowered her voice even lower, and together with Wanjuan, they approached Yang and asked, "Little son, this word can't be nonsense. If the emperor hears it, he will definitely be angry." Yang asked, "Why?" Mother Li had no choice but to answer, "Little young master. Have you ever heard of King Shenyang?" Yang had an epiphany. He didn't know who the name Au was, but he had seen the name of King Shenyang in the book. This hat was put on Feng Luan's head. Killing his brother was a real thing. At that time, several princes were fighting for the throne, and there were frequent tricks. Among them, Feng Luan was the most ruthless. Apart from a few of his half-brothers, he did not even spare his own younger brother, King Fengjiu of Shenyang. He stepped on the blood of his close relatives to ascend to the throne, and he washed away the dissidents in the Qing dynasty. He ascended the throne in just 1 month, has killed hundreds of people. This is called a tyrant. But Yang felt that Feng Luan was raving in his dream that day, and it seemed very guilty. If Au is the king of Shenyang, then this is a bad debt in the palace, and it has nothing to do with him. Mammy left. Yang was injured, and he was infected with the cold before. Getting out of bed and walking around would inevitably affect the wound, so Wanju sent Mammy Li out, and ran back, eager to go to the Yang offers advice. Yang picked up the medicine bowl and sipped it one by one, listening to her go down. The young master was injured because of the emperor. Wanjuan said seriously, "If the emperor comes again, you should tell the emperor that you have pain in the shoulder and ask the emperor to rub it." Yang choked on the medicine. No, the wound will hurt if you rub it." Wanjuan retorted, then let the emperor blow it." After saying this, she stood on her chest and looked very proud. Yang coughed a few times, and then deliberately asked, "Blow it? Then do you have to kiss and hold it high?" Wanjuan's eyes lit up, "Little son. Good strategy." Yang. Wan took another step forward and continued to offer advice, but the palace people outside the door had already said loudly, "The slaves are knocking on the emperor." Yang sighed. "What are you talking about? Why is this Feng Luan still staying in his palace and not leaving?" Yang responded quickly, "Yes, the special garlic peeler, that, cuckoo, say hello to the emperor." Feng Luan. Slave Wanjuan, meet the emperor. Wanjuan said nervously, "Your Majesty, little gentleman." "No, Yun Shijun was just talking about her shoulder pain." Yang. "No? Just this bad plan, really turned around and sold him? Feng Luan was slightly startled, looked up at Ye Yang, and asked hesitantly, "Your wound hurts? Would you like to pass it on to an imperial physician?" Ye Yang. He looked at Wang Juan's forehead against the ground, looking at it from his angle, he happened to see half of Wang Juan's face exposed from under his arms, those big eyes clicked, life winked at him. Ye Yang decided to pretend not to see, "No, no, small problem, I don't feel pain." Before she finished speaking, Wang Ju raised her head in hatred. Feng Luan was startled by her loud roar, "Ah!" Ye Yang shouted before her, "Flesh! It's okay." But he still didn't overpower the voice of the late cuckoo. The servant said it. "The wound hurts." Wang Juan shouted, "I want the emperor to kiss and hug, lift." "Hi! Hi! Ye Yang! Feng Luan!" Feng Luan was stagnant for a long time. Fang turned to look at Ye Yang, and reluctantly asked, "You? Things have developed to such a terrifying point, Ye Yang has no idea what to do, he can only shake his head desperately, indicating that he is in good health and does not need any strange spiritual comfort at all." But Wang Juan was still looking at them. Feng Luan couldn't help but look at Wang Juan again, "Then you?" Wan got up quickly and said, "Yes. Your Majesty. The servants will retire first." Ye Yang silently watched the small steps she took, only to feel that one head and two were big. Wang Juan has slipped away, but how can he explain to Feng Luan? Ye Yang bit his head and raised his head to look at Feng Luan. "The servant follows the master." Feng Luan raised his eyebrows slightly, a little displeased, "It's just a little palace maid, how dare you talk nonsense so boldly?" Feng Luan Favorability 5, Current Favorability Rating 32. Ye Yang. Ye Yang felt like he understood something. Fast. Some duplicity, just like a puberty stinky boy. Ye Yang tentatively asked, "You, why did the emperor come here again today?" Feng Luan seemed to have lost her previous good temper, frowned slightly, and said, "I came here to see your injury." Ye Yang did not speak. Ye Yang said happily, "Congratulations to the emperor." Feng Luan. Feng Luan turned around immediately, sat on the chair, and said loudly, "Kong Ning. Send me here without reading the book, I will rest here tonight." "It is." "Oh, little boy." Ye Yang is still testing Feng Luan's favor, "Your Majesty, political matters are important, I'm not seriously injured, you're tired of leaving me here all day long." "Feng Luan, what do you want to say, Shai Jun Yun?" "Of course." Ye Yang lowered his voice, "I advise you to reign, do, evenly, and stick." Feng Luan. Feng Luan's face gradually became gloomy, and Kong Ning, who delivered the book, couldn't help but wink at Ye Yang, telling him to stop talking. Since Ye Yang rescued Feng Luan, his affection for Ye Yang has skyrocketed. Naturally, he can't watch Ye Yang act stupid here. Bent down and said to Feng Luan, "Your Majesty, Lord Yun is injured, General Yun has submitted a contract today and wants to visit the palace." Feng Luan was already on the verge of sullenness, but Kong Ning's words reminded him of the spring night secret drama, his face darkened a bit, sneered, and said, "Visit? Didn't you just watch it a few days ago?" He seemed extremely annoyed, he picked up the red pen, and wrote the memorial. Ye Yang quietly straightened his neck to take a look, just as Feng Luan drew a large circle on the memorial, beside him, he was angry and criticized. "Ye Yang. Sorry, the third flower. You're in trouble." But he wants to test Feng Luan's favorability increase, so he has to continue. Ye Yang coughed and said deliberately, "Your Majesty, why don't you allow me to see my brother?" Feng Luan, "I say no, but no." Ye Yang, "Your Majesty, that's my brother, why are you so jealous?" Feng Luan. "Feng Luan, I don't have it." As soon as he finished speaking, Ye Yang saw a small red letter +1 silently appearing on Feng Luan's body. Sure. This is a high school boy who is arrogant and stinky. Ye Yang felt like he had grasped the key point of Feng Luan's favorability increase and decrease. He became more energetic in an instant, and decided to pursue the victory, at least to maintain Feng Luan's favorability at around 50, so that Feng Luan would not will fall in love with him. He can also sit back and relax in the palace. Ye Yang, whose vinegar jar has been turned over? Why is it irritating the eyes and choking the nose? This smell is old and domineering. Feng Luan, I don't have it. Feng Luan favorability +1, current favorability 34. Ye Yang, then why is it so sour? Feng Luan patted the pen and paper on the table. No. Ye Yang came to the final conclusion, you are just jealous. Feng Luan. Feng Luan seemed to finally realize that what he just argued was too naive. He turned his head stiffly, looked at Kong Ning beside him, and when he saw Kong Ning covering his face, he seemed unable to bear to look any longer. Ye Yang happened to spit out a sentence proudly, if you are sour, you will recognize it, it's not a big deal. Ding! Feng Luan favorability rating 1, current favorability rating 33. Ye Yang. Hey? What happened? Why did the good feelings suddenly drop? Ye Yang looked at Feng Luan, saw that Feng Luan's face was a little ugly. He hurriedly patted Feng Luan's rainbow fart, and immediately changed his words, I was wrong, of course you didn't. Jealous. You are magnanimous, benevolent, righteous, sensible, and the harem is as beautiful as clouds. How could you be jealous for a minister and a small servant? Feng Luan. Feng Luan favorability rating 1, current favorability rating 32. Ye Yang. Ye Yang decided to shut up. Feng Luan looked at the book with a cold face for a while, and waited for Imperial physician Rong to come up to change Ye Yang's medicine. Seeing that it took so long for Ye Yang to drink half of the medicine bowl in his hand, he couldn't help but drink more. He said, Your Majesty, take this medicine warm, if it gets cold, the efficacy of the medicine will be discounted. Ye Yang frowned and took another sip of the medicine. I really don't blame him for taking medicine slowly. In this world, when he was sick, most of the pills he took, he closed his eyes and swallowed a mouthful of water, but in this book, he drank all medicine the soup. He was a little afraid of bitterness, he couldn't drink it even while pinching his nose. After 2 sips, his stomach turned up. Feng Luan was on the side, his eyes did not take his eyes off the book, his tone was still cold, but he suddenly said, if you want to see your family, wait until you get better, I will allow you. Your parents and brother will enter the palace together. Where did Ye Yang dare to talk nonsense? He naturally nodded and said, thank you for the grace of the emperor. Listening to his answer, Feng Luan raised his eyes slightly, moved his gaze to him from the booklet, and said, then you don't drink the medicine. Ye Yang couldn't help but startled. Feng Luan was clearly concerned, but he had to say it in such a tone, he couldn't help bending his lips slightly, and before he opened his mouth, he suddenly saw Feng Luan added 2 more favors. Ye Yang. He noticed that this tyrant seems to be a handsome dog. He speaks well with Yunyang's handsome face, which can easily increase Feng Luan's favorability. He finally figured out some of Feng Luan's temperament, and he was in a good mood for a while. Looking at the half bowl of medicine in front of him, he still drank the medicine bravely, turned his head and looked up at Feng Luan, just seeing Feng Luan pursing his lips slightly, followed by small words of goodwill appearing on his body. Feng Luan favorability +5, current favorability 40. That night Feng Luan stayed here for the night, and the next day he got up and went to the court as usual, while Ye Yang was still holding the quilt and slept in a daze, and even couldn't help thinking about it in his heart. This is a tyrant. The young man is diligent in his court every day, and he spends 9 out of 10 times watching the book. It is so moving. He slept with no guilt until 3 poles in the sun before he got up. He thought that today would be the same as usual, and the salted fish would be gone for a day. It was the Empress Dowager who sent a message and asked Shai Jun to go to the Sinaing Palace. Wan Juan jumped up nervously, and wanted to pounce in front of Ye Yang, and whispered to him, Little master. The Queen Mother is going to give you the power. Ya Yang, dismount. What did he do? Why do you want to dispose of him? Wanjuan, the Emperor has been staying here for several nights, you are already a favorite. Ya Yang. Hey? This is the favor? Did Shang Chong come so easily? The Emperor used to come to the harem less often, and hardly ever spent the night in the harem. Wanjuan said seriously, you are already the only favorite of the harem. Ya Yang sighed deeply. According to the plot in the book he remembered, the Queen Mother was not Feng Luan's biological mother, she ate fast and chanted Buddha in the deep palace all the year round. Judging from the description of the details when she and Feng Luan were in the same frame, Ya Yang always felt that Feng Luan seemed a little afraid of her. To embarrass him, he can only bite the bullet. Ya Yang could only pack up a little and go to the Sinaing Palace to meet the Queen Mother. At this hour, the Queen Mother is paying homage to the Buddha. Ya Yang is standing and waiting in the palace, he is injured, but there is no chair in the Sinaing Palace, and all the palace people think that he does not exist. Apparently, the Queen Mother had entrusted him, and she must give him a look today. He stood with sore calves, and the cold was not healed, so he could not avoid coughing a few times. Bullying, it's just that she has no experience in dealing with these things, and she really doesn't know what to do. Ya Yang waited in the hall for more than half an hour, the Queen Mother still did not appear, but saw a young female officer dressed as a man stepping into the hall, seeing him here, could not help but slightly towards him with a smile. He turned his head and instructed the palace maid beside him, Servant Yun is ill, why don't you find a chair for Mistress Yun? Before she finished speaking, Ya Yang had already seen small words of goodwill appear on her body. Ming Yan favor +5, current favor 35 Ming Yan? Ya Yang couldn't help being surprised. This is the Queen Mother's favorite niece in the book, one of the 3 giants of the palace fight, and the future virtuous concubine. Mingyan's initial goodwill towards him, why is it so high? He was full of doubts. At least the maids brought chairs for him, he sat down just now, and the Queen Mother came out. Ya Yang had to stand up again and saluted. The Queen Mother looked at him up and down, straight to the point, and said, Yun Shijun has been favored recently, and he should persuade the Emperor more, not to favor only one person. Ya Yang nodded vigorously, yes, yes, the Queen Mother, you are right, it is the rain and the dew. Ming Yan coughed twice and winked at him forcefully. The Queen Mother didn't seem to expect him to promise so simply, she was stunned for a moment, and then went on, the Emperor has no children at his age, and the AI family has always been worried. Ya Yang agrees very much, the Queen Mother is relieved, the minister will persuade the Emperor when he goes back, go to Concubine Chu and Concubine Shen more on weekdays, and strive to continue the incense for the royal family as soon as possible, spread branches and leaves, and give birth to him. 17 or 8 princes. He was still a little excited when he said this, and he waved his hand suddenly, and the wide sleeve was thrown back, and it was thrown on the face of Feng Luan who appeared behind him at an unknown time. The two looked at each other, and the scene suddenly became awkward. Ya Yang twitched the corners of his mouth, Emperor, Emperor. Feng Luan. The Empress Dowager said with a smile, Emperor, you are here at the right time, listen to the persuasion, Yun Shijun is so generous and virtuous, and Prime Minister Yun really taught a good child. Feng Luan gritted her teeth and looked at Ya Yang. I am late, I have never heard how Mistress Yun is trying to persuade me. With a smile on his face, he said to Ya Yang every word, Servant Yun, it's not as good as you. Say it again. Ya Yang. Ya Yang looked at Feng Luan's gloomy face and hesitated several times, really not knowing how he could explain it. He knew that Feng Luan was angry, but at this moment, he could only barely tug at the corner of his mouth and smiled at Feng Luan, and said, Your Majesty, I advise you to soak up the rain and dew. Feng Luan. Feng Luan favorability rating 10, current favorability rating 30. Ya Yang almost shed tears on the spot. His favorability level rose back so easily, why did it suddenly change back to 30? Ye Yang stiffened and looked away. He couldn't understand why Feng Luan suddenly appeared here, and when he looked around, he saw Wanjuan and Mammy Li sticking out half of their heads outside the hall. Then the matter is much simpler. I thought it was because I was worried about his accident, so I ran to look for Li Ma's help. Li Ma was also at a loss, and simply called Feng Luan. Feng Luan thought that he was punished by the Queen Mother, and thought that he was injured, so he rushed over in a hurry, and happened to hear Ye Yang shouting to let him soak in the rain and dew. Ye Yang could imagine Feng Luan's anger at this time. His favor ability was only 30, he didn't dare to talk nonsense anymore, so he had to lower his head, looking like he was still a little aggrieved. The Empress Dowager said, "Emperor, you should also listen to other people's advice." Feng Luan said with a cold face, "Mother, my son has something to do, so please retire first." He grabbed Ye Yang's arm and dragged Ye Yang out, but Ye Yang was injured on his shoulder, and it was that arm that Feng Luan was pulling, and it was painful when he pulled it. Ye Yang covered his shoulders with one hand. He always felt that Yunyang's bean sprout-like body was too weak to endure pain. With such a small injury, he was shivering in pain. He finally followed Feng Luan out of the hall. Looking up at Feng Luan, before opening her mouth, a tear splattered on the hand that Feng Luan was dragging. Ye Yang was taken aback. "Wait, what is that? Tears?" he cried. He raised his hand and wiped his face. It was wet right now, he seemed to be really crying. Ye Yang wiped his face indiscriminately. Fang held back the tears, not wanting to seal the unknowingly. Luan dragged him 2 more steps, the wound on his shoulder was painful, and the tears couldn't stop falling down. Feng Luan finally stopped, looked back at him suspiciously, and asked, "You?" Ye Yang covered his face with one hand and said righteously, "It's not me, don't look at me." He felt a little embarrassed. Such a big man, how could he shed tears when he was in pain? He seemed to have reddened his ears for a while, but he could only raise his hand to block Feng Luan's gaze, while murmuring, "The man doesn't cry easily, anyway, it's not me anyway. That is Yunyang's body sensitive and afraid of pain, what does it have to do with him?" Ye Yang. Feng Luan. Feng Luan seemed to realize at this moment that he was holding Ye Yang's injured hand when he was angry. He was a little overwhelmed and turned to look at Kong Ning beside him. Said to him with his lips, "Your Majesty, apologize quickly." Feng Luan, After all, he is the king of a country. He has never said sorry to anyone when he is so old. Now he looks at Ye Yang, an apology is stuck in his throat, he can't say it, and Ye Yang still covered his face with his sleeve, waved at him, and said, "I'm fine," hiccup. Ye Yang. Feng Luan. Cry. Why is he hiccuping? Ye Yang's face was flushed and embarrassed, he had not shed tears like this for several years, even in his knowledge, even if he wanted to cry, a manly man should hide secretly its right to cry. Feng Luan panicked. It's not that he hasn't seen people cry. People in high positions like him have long been accustomed to seeing emotions. He had seen many people cry, but Ye Yang was so good looking that he cried in a pitiful manner. Besides, Ye Yang was injured by blocking the knife for him. He was so angry that he hurt others' wounds. Also made people cry. Feng Luan. Feng Luan bit her head and turned her head to look at Ye Yang, cleared her throat, and said stiffly, "You, don't cry." Ye Yang also replied in a muffled voice, I didn't cry." Feng Luan gritted his teeth and apologized, "It's my fault, I shouldn't be pulling your arm, does it hurt? Do you want to find a doctor?" Ye Yang took a breath, "I'm fine, I don't hurt," hiccup. Ye Yang. Feng Luan. This scene seems to be even more embarrassing. Ye Yang really didn't know how he could explain to Feng Luan, he really didn't want to cry at all, but the tears couldn't stop falling, he was almost embarrassed to death by himself. He paused for a moment, took a deep breath, wiped his face with his sleeve, strode forward, and said, "I'm fine, I'll go back first." Feng Luan froze in place for a moment, while Kong Ning couldn't help pushing his arm. He also took a deep breath, followed Ye Yang's footsteps and followed Ye Yang, but he didn't dare to going forward to talk to Ye Yang, for fear of making Ye Yang cry again. He looked like a little kid who did something wrong. Wan Juan was thoughtful. She hurried to Ye Yang's side, lowered her voice and hurriedly said, "Young master, you are still amazing. The emperor is tempted at once." Ye Yang. He wasn't happy at all. He just hoped that he could return to the palace as soon as possible and throw away Feng Luan. But he apparently forgot another thing. Feng Luan promised him yesterday that his parents and brother would be allowed to visit the palace, but he went to the Sinaing Palace early in the morning and never heard anyone tell him about the matter. Yunrin and the others who were led by the palace servants collided with each other. Although Ye Yang had held back his tears, the corners of his eyes were flushed, and he looked like he had just cried. Feng Luan followed behind him with a guilt expression, and looked up to see Yunrin's face darkened, and she felt bad in her heart. The Yun family is a combination of strict parents and loving mothers. When the old lady saw Ye Yang like this, her eyes turned red, and Prime Minister Yun was still calm. He wouldn't blame Feng Luan for this, but Yunrin's face was gloomy, and he seemed extremely unhappy, barely holding back. Ye Yang had no choice but to explain, I just fell in the Imperial garden. Feng Luan has already said, it's my fault. Ye Yang looked back at him in amazement. He didn't expect Feng Luan to admit his mistake. He didn't know how to deal with it, but Feng Luan stopped talking. With him here, the three of the Yun family were somewhat restrained and said a few words hastily, but Yunrin still frowned. So many things happened one after another these few days. Ye Yang guessed that Yunrin was dissatisfied. He frowned for a while, but he couldn't make up an excuse. When he left, he gently pulled Yunrin's sleeve and whispered to Yunrin, "Brother, you don't have to think too much." Yunrin couldn't help frowning. Feng Luan sat on the outside and turned over the book, thinking that he couldn't hear them whispering. He couldn't help but lowered his voice and asked, "Are you crying?" Ye Yang could only force himself to explain, "Brother, I am all willing." Yunlin. When Yunrin left, she looked at Feng Luan with a complex expression. Feng Luan didn't know why, so after the palace servants sent the Yun family out of the palace, he got up and went to Ye Yang's side, coughed lightly, as if he had finally made up his mind, and said to Ye Yang, I want to tell you something." Ye Yang shrank back silently. The tyrant is so serious, he always feels that it will not be a good thing. "I heard everything you said in Sinaing Palace today." Feng Luan said, "You should also know that the Queen Mother hopes that I will continue the bloodline for the royal family as soon as possible." Ye Yang nodded nervously. Feng Luan said, "But I don't want this." He didn't seem to know how to express what he was thinking to Ye Yang. He frowned for a moment, and then reluctantly said the next sentence, "Besides you, there is also Concubine Chu in the harem. With Concubine Shen, but I have no interest." Wait, this plot, in which book did he read it? Ye Yang had an epiphany. "The elders are pressing for marriage, do you want me to help you block?" Ye Yang was shocked. "No, but I can't give birth either, Your Majesty, don't you want to leave the palace? Can you just bring one back?" Feng Luan. Ye Yang remembered the stares of Chu Lian and the Empress Dowager, and shivered, shook his head and refused, "I'm afraid of death, but I can't." Feng Luan. Ye Yang, would you like to discuss with Concubine Chu? I think she is very rude to you. Feng Luan. Feng Luan favorability rating 10, current favorability rating 20. Ye Yang, just. Concubine Chu is also a beautiful old girl. Feng Luan favorability level 10, current favorability level 10. Ye Yang. Ye Yang quickly changed his words, "I promise you." Feng Luan nodded slightly and said, "Don't worry, I will take care of you." Ye Yang was speechless. He blocked a knife for others, and it was only after a few days that his favorability was pulled back to over 30. Why did the two questions suddenly return to before liberation? He didn't understand Feng Luan's thoughts. According to Feng Luan's age, in the ancient group of emperors, children should have been running around in groups, but Feng Luan is not even a harem I am willing to come. In the original book, he was forced to spend the night in the Chu Lian palace by the Queen Mother. Although it was later said that Chu Lian was pregnant, but the lantern passed by in a hurry, and there was no specific description for half a word. Ye Yang thought about it. After a long while, I could only barely draw a relatively reliable conclusion. Some of the functions of this tyrant. Shouldn't there be some obstacles? He suddenly realized. If this is the case, it can also explain why Feng Luan is so innocent. As we all know, being faster and smaller does not affect reproductive function, but it will make people feel inferior, especially Feng Luan is a million people the supreme being above. If it wasn't for the Empress Dowager in the original book, he wouldn't be reluctant to expose his shortcomings. Too bad. It's too bad. I can tell. Feng Luan said, you don't like staying in the palace. Ye Yang looked at him with sympathy. I promise you. Feng Luan frowned slightly, you just need to cover up for me for a while, I will protect your life and prosperity, after everything is over, I will find a way to let you out of the palace. Ye Yang held Feng Luan's hand with tears in his eyes. You can rest assured, Your Majesty, it's all from the great men, I know it too well. Ye Yang was full of sincerity, you squeak, I'll hide everything from you. Feng Luan, squeak.